What if I told you that church scandals aren't just random? That the biggest church failures, cover-ups, abuses, financial fraud, that none of them are one-off events, but instead, they're part of a repeatable, predictable pattern. We're talking about a hidden system, a cycle that churches keep falling into, and worse, it's one that keeps really good people silent, while at the same time protecting those in power. But today, we're going to expose the pattern, and I'm going to walk you through what I believe is a groundbreaking research study that uncovers the warning signs of toxic leadership. And I want to use it to show you how churches set themselves up for failure, and most importantly, what are the things that we can all do to make sure that this stuff stops happening? Because here's the truth. If we don't fix this, the reality is we're going to see the next scandal before we finish recovering from the last one. So whether you're a church leader, a church member, or just someone who cares about integrity in the church, buckle up, because this is a conversation that I believe really matters and one that we have to have. All right, so let's get into it. And before we go any farther, I want to let you know we're not just making guesses here in this episode. This isn't just one person's opinion. This isn't about what Jeff thinks or about what this person thinks or that person thinks. Instead, we're going to look at a research study that we just published at SAI called the Building Safer Churches Report. And what we did in that study was we analyzed patterns in churches that have experienced scandals and those who have avoided them. Now, this study specifically analyzed publicly available data from 100 churches that faced public scandal within the last decade. So we looked at churches that have faced public scandal from 2015 all the way to 2024. And the overwhelming majority of the churches and ministries on this list actually faced public scandal in the last 2 years. We included a few that went further back because they were big scandals, but for the most part, we looked at churches that have faced scandal in just the last couple of years. And for a church to be included in this research, we had to have public news sources or media confirmation of the scandal. They had to be published. We had to be able to look at that. So we're not the ones defining, hey, we felt like what they went through was a scandal. And if you look at the white paper that we've released with this research, I'm going to link it in the description below, or you can go to spiritualabuse.institute, our website, and click on the research tab. You're going to find this. I want you to go look at it. It's going to have more information we're just going to cover today. But at the beginning of that study, we define very clearly what we mean by scandal, because that can mean different things to different people. So we define that, and we had to find news reports that confirmed this. Now, the study as a whole, it measured adherence to kind of common, simple safety practices across 3 major categories. And if you're familiar with the Safe Church Pledge, you're going to recognize these, because this is really where the Safe Church Pledge came from. It came out of this research. I've been looking at this research for a few months now. We weren't ready to release it. We still had some work to do. But all of this research informed the Safe Church Pledge. So we looked at 3 major categories with these churches. How did they score in the areas of transparency, accountability, and protective measures? And guys, the findings from this research reveal an absolutely pervasive lack of these simple practices: transparency, accountability, and protective measures. And the lack of these practices correlate with much higher risk of misconduct and diminished public trust. So you may be saying, Jeff, I get it. You guys did some research. Why does this matter? Well, I think this matters for every single Christian. Every single person who calls themselves a Christian who loves the church. And here's why. Public church scandals, whether you like it or not, whether we wish it was the case or not, public church scandals have risen dramatically in recent years. And what's been kind of the result of those public church scandals? A lot of eroding of public trust in the institution of the church and in its leaders. According to a recent Gallup poll, public trust in pastors and clergy has reached an all-time low. For as long as they've been measuring it, public trust in clergy has reached an all-time low of 32%. Okay, only 32% of people trust clergy and pastors. So here's the deal. If the church doesn't change, if churches don't change, scandals will only increase. This isn't going away. It's going to keep getting worse until we do something different. 69% of churches that we looked at, in that list of 100 churches, 69% of them scored a 0 across the categories of transparency, accountability, and protective measures. 69% didn't even register a score because they had none of the things that we were looking for. None of these basic safety practices, transparency practices. So what that means, they had 0 public evidence of what we would expect to see from safe and healthy churches. I want you to think about that for a minute. That's just shy of 7 out of 10 of these 100 churches that faced very public scandal. 7 out of 10 of them that faced scandal in recent years had 0 of the 10 safety elements that we looked at in this research. And the highest overall score among all of the 100 ministries that we researched was a measly 4 out of 10. The highest score out of all 100 was a 4 out of 10. 40% is not a passing measure in any test that you're going to take anywhere. That's how little of these safety practices that we would expect to see in safe and healthy churches, easy safe practices to implement that any church can implement, we couldn't find them in the majority of these churches. And when the highest score is 4 out of 10, we've got a problem. Not only that, only 8 out of the 100 churches that we researched scored a 3 or above. Let that sink in. Only 8% of these churches facing scandal even made it to a 3 or above out of 10. By simply doing things like general things like filing a 990 or a similar level financial disclosure, sharing their governance structure, how they're led, sharing who their board members are and how to contact them, publicly disclosing their basic affiliations, like are they a part of ARC, are they a part of the SBC, are they a part of this group or that group, and publishing their child protection policy and just saying, hey, here are the things that we're doing to protect children. By simply doing those things, a ministry would have scored a 6. Not a single church on this list scored a 6. Why? Because they didn't do even those simple things. So the reason why I'm telling you that is because I want you to understand, out of these 100 churches that have faced recent scandal, they weren't doing even very simple things to do that help churches avoid this kind of behavior and protect people. Now, out of the 3 categories, transparency, accountability, and protective measures, among the 100 churches, the lowest scoring category by far was transparency. And I don't think that's really a surprise. If you've been following, our work, you've been following some of these other church scandals, fallen leaders, moral failures, all of that, the fact that they're not very transparent, these kind of churches, probably doesn't surprise you. But it did surprise me that it was as low as it was. The average ministry in this study scored a 0.05 out of 4 in the transparency category. The majority of them didn't even register a score. 95% of all 100 churches, 95% of them scored a 0 in the transparency category. And only 2 churches, 2 out of 100, met the basic financial transparency standards of secular nonprofit entities. So we're not asking them to do crazy things. We're asking them, hey, are you doing even the basic requirements that are legally required of any other nonprofit entity? Just like SAI, the Spiritual Abuse Institute, we have to file a 990 report every year. Now, because we're small, the one we actually had to file isn't very detailed, but if you go to our website and you check on the financial information right there, we have financial reports that are very detailed that we publicly disclose on our own because we want to be transparent. But in the cases of these churches, only 2 of them met the basic financial transparency requirements that a general nonprofit would have to. That is wild to me But it just goes to show you how secretive, how much lack of accountability, how little transparency and little protective measures actually exist in the churches that end up making news headlines. It is so easy to break this pattern and make safer churches, but a lot of church leaders, they don't want to talk about that. They want to use a lot of excuses, and you're going to see how easy it is for our churches to take massive steps towards safety. So if you are as tired of scandals and just, the corruption as I am, in this podcast episode, we're going to look at this research, and you're going to know exactly how your church and the churches in your community, how you as church leaders, if you're a church leader that's listening, how we can take simple steps that make it much less likely that our churches are going to end up in these headlines. And these are ways that we can start really challenging churches to do something a little bit different. So what does the research tell us? It tells us a couple of things. One, it tells us that church scandals don't happen in isolation. Church scandals happen because churches set themselves up for failure. You can look at a church, and I believe we can look at a church and look at these common safety practices, and based on how many of these common safety practices they have, we can have a pretty good guess on how likely they are to end up in the news doing something that is heinous or having a leader that completely goes off the rails. Why? Because when there's no accountability, when there's no transparency, when there's no checks and balances, bad leadership thrives. And here's the real kicker. Most of these warning signs, if you look at these churches before the scandal broke, the majority of these warning signs existed for years before these scandals ever made the news. If these churches had done anything about it, we could have protected a lot of victims of spiritual abuse, of SA, of financial fraud, all kinds of things. So let that sink in for a minute. This isn't just a problem with bad leaders, okay? This problem of church scandal and corruption, it's not just bad leaders, it's broken systems. Broken systems that let bad leaders operate unchecked. And it doesn't matter how many of these leaders we hold accountable. If we don't fix the system that enables these kind of leaders, then the next scandal, it's already on its way. So as it turns out, church failure, church scandal, church corruption, none of those things are random. They're actually very predictable. And the same patterns keep repeating in different churches, different cities, and different denominations over and over and over. So let's think about this for just a couple of minutes before we move on to the next segment. Church scandals, if they don't happen in a vacuum, and they happen when churches ignore basic safety, transparency, and accountability measures, then what do we need to do to make sure that church scandals don't happen? I want you just to think about that, because we can kind of predict when they're going to happen. Think about what you think we could change, and then as we go through the research in the video, see if it lines up with the stuff that we're saying. If it doesn't, you're thinking of something else, let me know. We'd love to look into it. But I also want you to think about the latest kind of major church scandal that you've heard about. So think about it, picture it in your mind. Now that you've got it in your mind, I want you to tell me this. Did that church scandal involve any form of unchecked or unaccountable church leadership? Did it involve a lack of accountability of any kind? Did it involve an unwillingness to listen to criticism? If so, you've already noticed part of this pattern in action. So let's ask the big question together. How in the world do these things happen? Why do so many churches fall into the same mess over and over and over? Well, I want to give you a few steps to the pattern that happen in almost every one of these situations. Then we're going to break down a little bit more of the research in the Building Safe Churches study. Step one to church scandal is usually that a charismatic leader becomes untouchable. It's so often these scandals, they start with a gifted, passionate leader, and then what happens? The church grows, excitement builds, but over time, criticism starts to become persecution, and doubts from people within the church begin to become spiritual attacks. And when you start taking as a leader criticism as persecution and people's doubts or questions as spiritual attacks, then before you know it, that leader is untouchable and isolated and insulated because they see everybody who comes against them as someone who's spiritually attacking them, someone who the enemy is using, or the way that Landon Schott and Mike Bickle and Dr. Michael Brown and all of those guys have recently called it, people become the accuser of the brethren just because they ask questions. So that's step number one. A charismatic leader rises up and becomes untouchable. Step number two in the majority of these scandals is that transparency is replaced by secrecy. Then there's the money piece of it, right? The money piece is one of the first places that you normally will see this. There's all of a sudden no financial accountability, or a lot less financial accountability than there was before. Outside the financial piece, you'll see another way that transparency is replaced by secrecy is that the board or the governing body usually becomes stacked with more and more yes men and yes people. Leadership meetings, they start happening behind closed doors, and nobody is sharing the reports of what happened with the public. Now, for those of you that don't know, again, one of our values at SAI is we try to set the example for churches. We're not just going to pick on churches and challenge churches to be safe and then not try to set the example. So we try to do that with our financial reporting, but also at any point, if someone wants to know what happened in a board meeting, we record all of those, we have the minutes from all of those, and we'll gladly share with someone what was talked about in the board meeting. Just recently, we had a board meeting where we were talking about just kind of the state of SAI. We were talking about fundraising. We were talking about different initiatives that are going on. And those reports are available if someone wants to see them. When your church starts having those leadership meetings behind closed doors and they're not willing to share publicly what happened, that is generally a big red flag. And here's some other red flags that we found in the data in the Building Safe Churches research report. When it comes to this idea of transparency being replaced by secrecy, 23% of the scandals that the study involved confirmed the use of NDAs. Okay, 23%, almost a quarter, confirmed they use NDAs to silence people and keep things secret. And only 2% of ministries publicly committed to avoiding NDAs. We think it should be really simple that close to 100% of churches say, we're not going to use NDAs. It doesn't make any sense. Or if they are going to use them, to say it only makes sense in very specific situations. But that's the opposite of what we saw in these churches facing scandals. Another thing that we saw was only 17%. So under 20% of these ministries had independent governance structures. And independent governance just means that, hey, these are the people who are governing this church, they're not financially tied to the pastor, which means they're not employees of the church generally. They're not tied to the pastor as family members, right? And they don't have like a super close friendship with the pastor, because you can't be independent and hold someone accountable if you're their family, you're a very close friend, or if you have financial ties to them. So when we put our board together, one of the ways that we put the SAI board together, which by the way, if you don't know, as the executive director of SAI, I'm not a voting member of the board. I'm there at the board meetings. I help run the board meetings, but I'm not a voting member. They can kick me out at any time. But when we were instituting the board, what we looked for was we didn't want my close friends on the board. So you're not going to see my close friends on the board. And the majority of the board are actually people that outside of these board meetings, I don't spend a lot of time with. As a matter of fact, just last week, we have a new board member that just came on. And last week, I met her for the first time because she was nominated and voted on by the board. I don't even know her. That's helpful because in that situation, the board is independent. These people can hold me accountable because their livelihood is not tied to SAI. They're not close friends of mine, and they can be generally independent. So only 17% of churches had that kind of independent board, all right? None of the churches, 0%. This is crazy because this is such an easy way to provide transparency and accountability. 0% of churches that we studied had their bylaws publicly available before the scandal. Now, quite a few of them made their bylaws available after the scandal as part of a PR response and part of a response in good faith to not have these scandals in the future, because that's a really easy way to be transparent. Again, and I'm not trying to toot our own horn. I'm trying to show you, we're trying to put our money where our mouth is here as we challenge these churches. If you go to Spiritual Abuse Institute right now, you can find at the bottom of the website, our bylaws are made publicly available. So you can find out everything that you want to know about how we legally have to operate, and have chosen to operate as an organization. You can actually see we don't pay employees, we only pay contractors. So for instance, I am a contractor. Anytime I get paid, it's for completed projects, but you can actually go on into our bylaws and you can see the maximum amount that any contractor can be paid, including me. And it's not a very large amount, right? Because we have it in our bylaws that we are trying to create this from the very beginning, that this isn't a get-rich scheme because no one can get rich from SAI. So all of those things are in our bylaws, including how I can be removed, including how the board is chosen, how often we have to meet, all of those things. And it's there, made publicly available. None of the churches we studied, none of these 100 churches facing scandal had their bylaws available before the scandal. We looked at a lot of internet archives, none of them had it available. Moreover, only 3%, this is a tiny number, 3 of the 100 ministries that we studied had child protection policies that were publicly disclosed or even had instructions for how parents could review such a policy. So if they didn't want to publicly disclose it, we would still count the point for them. We would score it for them positively if they had instructions on how the parents could find the child protection policy. 3% were willing to tell parents what they do to keep children protected, right? More than that, this one blew my mind. It's the last thing I'll say on this transparency and secrecy piece. Multiple nonprofits, multiple of these ministries were nonprofits that reclassified as churches over the last decade just so they could avoid 990s and public financial disclosures. Because what's the best way to avoid being transparent in today's world as an organization? Is to classify yourself as a church, because churches aren't required to be transparent. Here's the thing though, even if churches aren't required to be transparent, I believe from my study of Scripture that whether you're required to be transparent or not, churches should be the most transparent and accountable organizations on the planet, because that's just what Scripture, I believe, teaches as our standard. So let's think about this normal kind of pattern for how scandals happen. Step 1, the charismatic leader becomes untouchable. Step 2, transparency is replaced by secrecy, and that brings us to step number 3. Step 3, the system starts to protect the institution over the people. The system gets a life of its own and starts to protect the institution and its leaders instead of the people and the parishioners of the church. So here's what this looks like practically. When concerns come up, concerns of anything, even if it includes things like abuse, financial fraud, or corruption, the priority isn't doing the right thing. The priority isn't protecting the people of the church. The priority becomes protecting the ministry and its reputation. So what happens? Victims, they get ignored. Whistleblowers end up getting silenced, and the cycle repeats over and over and over again. All right. So how did we see this play out in the research? The system protecting itself over the people. Well, only 14% of these churches, when they face scandal, commissioned an independent third-party investigation into the alleged misconduct. And out of those 14%, only 7% actually did so on their own. The other 7%, they didn't do an independent investigation until months or years after the allegations were made, after a lot of public pressure mounted, and some of them weren't started until years later when pastors were questioned at other churches, and those churches triggered the independent investigation. So only 7 out of those 14% commissioned an independent investigation within the first few weeks or the first month or so of allegations being made. Again, you would think, especially when it's like potentially criminal allegations, but even with heavy spiritual abuse allegations, you would think churches would say, whoa, very quickly, we want to get investigators in here and we want to either prove that these allegations were false or find out they were true and take care of the victims and make sure it doesn't happen again. But that wasn't the case. Why? Because the system was protecting itself and the institution and its leaders over the people. We also found in the research that 66% of the leaders who were accused of misconduct were eventually removed, no matter how hard the churches fought, because the evidence became so overwhelming and the public pressure mounted where they had to end up releasing these leaders, because more often than not, these allegations are credible. We tend to like to talk about this in church world, especially like people are bringing false accusations all the time. And while that does happen, it's usually probably 5 to 7% max of these allegations that are false. The research has shown time and time again, a lot of different studies, that allegations like this, they're normally true because I'm telling you, when somebody makes allegations like this, the church is going to put them through the ringer, and that shouldn't be the case. So we asked this question. As I was looking through all of this research and we were looking through all of it together, did these ministries learn from their failures? And the answer is they didn't appear to, because more churches than not that we studied were less transparent, less accountable, and had less protective measures after the scandal than they did before. So they had this scandal, and instead of getting more transparent, more protective, more accountable, they got less transparent and basically just said, we're not going to give any information out, and that's how we're going to protect the institution. Because again, they doubled and tripled down more than not on protecting the institution instead of protecting people. So let me ask you, where are you at? Have you seen this before? Have you seen a leader in the church who couldn't be questioned? Have you seen a church or a ministry where financial records weren't open? Have you seen a scandal where people seemed more focused and interested on protecting the church and protecting the reputation of the church than doing what was right? And have you ever seen a church struggle through scandal where you ended up noticing, hey, there were warning signs that were missed? And if so, let me know in the comments below, what were those warning signs? Because the likely thing is you probably answered yes to a lot of those questions, because these scandals, they follow a pattern. And if we just pay attention to the safety measures that are in place in a church, we'll know how likely they are to actually have these kind of things happen, and we can try to prevent them. That's the way this normally works. How does scandal happen? Well, first, a charismatic leader becomes untouchable. Second, transparency is replaced by secrecy in the church or ministry. And third, the system starts protecting the institution and its leaders over people. So when we look at this Building Safe Churches study and report, what are some of the biggest lessons we can learn from the research? I want to give you 4 lessons that I think not only we can easily learn as the church, but I think we have to learn. And if your church, just being completely honest, if your church doesn't already have these 4 things in place, it's already at risk. So it is vital that we learn these lessons and we put these things in place. Lesson number 1, very simple. Transparency is almost non-existent in our churches today, and it's almost always non-existent in churches that face scandal. Again, a key stat from the research, 95% of the churches that we studied here, 95 out of 100, failed the basic financial transparency standards that are required of secular nonprofits. And it's not just the financial stuff, but it's the stuff that also comes on the 990s about governance. Transparency at its most basic level should look like what secular nonprofits have to do legally. That means publicly available financial reports with a 990 level disclosure. It means a clear disclosure of your ministry affiliations and the different groups that you're donating to and giving distributions to. And it should include open records on your government structures and your board decisions. You should be able to look up at any time who the board is. And again, on those 990 disclosures, you can see if any of the board's making money, how much money that they're making, how much time that they're putting into this. All of that stuff should be publicly available. So let me ask you this about your church. Does your church publish detailed financial statements? And if not, why do you think that is? Have you ever asked anybody about it? I would just encourage you to ask. All right, so that's lesson number 1. Lesson number 2, church boards often protect pastors instead of people, and that has to change because the church board, the church governance, is there to protect the church, and the church is the people. Now, is the pastor a part of that church? Yes. But the pastors, the church staff should never be protected more or over the people. Again, another key stat from the research on this, only 17% of ministries that we studied had that independent governing body, and 0% of those churches made their bylaws public before the scandal. So they weren't showing real accountability. Now, you may ask the question, Jeff, what should real accountability look like? I think it's really simple. We line out a lot of this stuff in the Safe Church Pledge. So you can look at this research, you can go way more in depth into it, after you look at the white paper, you go through all the research, look at the Safe Church Pledge. The Safe Church Pledge is the answer to this research. It says, okay, now that we've seen these trends and patterns, what can we do? And we took it even farther and actually have highlighted 16 simple and common safe church practices. But this was the idea of, let's create a pledge to where we can take action and do the things that are going to keep us from getting involved in scandal. So here's what the Safe Church Pledge tells us accountability should look like. 1, at least 2/3 of a church board should be independent. And that means no financial, familial, or close friendship ties to the pastor or really any of the staff. Number 2, make the bylaws public. Make the bylaws of your church public. Don't rewrite them or wait to make them public till after scandal. Just go ahead and do that. And then the last thing, pastors should be accountable to the board and the congregation at some level, not just close friends and family. So this board needs to not just be independent, it needs to be a legitimate board. And if the board is not doing its job, then at some level, the church needs to be holding the pastor accountable. The pastor needs to be accountable to the congregation. So that doesn't mean you have to be congregationally led, but there needs to be some way, if nothing else, that the church could call for a vote of no confidence or an investigation if they see that the board is not doing their job. Why do you think so many church boards end up acting more like PR teams instead of accountability structures? Because that's what I see. I see a lot of church boards that have really taken on the role of just a good PR team to protect the church's reputation and to protect the pastor and its leaders instead of protecting the people and really governing the church. Lesson number 3, protective measures are more often than not missing in unsafe churches. We need to be much more intentional about creating protective measures. And again, only 3% of the churches in this study had published public child protection policies, and 23% of the churches involved in scandals confirmed their use of NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, to keep people silent and to keep secrets. These protective measures are missing in a lot of our churches, too many of our churches. What does real protection look like? What does it look like to have these protective measures in place? It would be things like having clear reporting policies and processes for misconduct. So everybody in your church should know if there's sin, misconduct, criminal activity, whatever, how do I report that? Now, again, criminal activity is easy because you can report it to the authorities, but a lot of spiritual abuse, people don't know if it's criminal. A lot of it's not criminal. So there should be clear reporting processes where everybody in the church knows, how do I report it if I see something going wrong? Also, there should be publicly available child, teen, and adult protection policies, I believe. Those protection policies, they're not going to include every level of detail because some things you need to say, hey, here's what we're doing at a basic level, but we're not going to tell you why or how because we want to keep the environment safe. We don't want that information public. Most of that information can be made public. Things like, hey, we're always going to have 2 people in these rooms, or we're going to have the door open when there's adults with children, all kinds of stuff like that. How they do background checks, all of that kind of thing can be included. And then kind of the last thing, I think protection looks very simple, and there's a lot more things you can do, but this is the last really easy one. Just commit as a church to not use NDAs. We're not going to use NDAs or any other silencing documents to silence victims and employees. We have nothing to hide, so we're not going to try to silence people's voices. Now, I want to ask you this question, though, before we move on to lesson number 4. If a church is unwilling to have a public child protection policy, and it's unwilling to publicly commit to not silencing people through NDAs, what does that communicate about that church's priorities? I don't think it communicates anything good. And that brings us to lesson number 4. Lesson number 4 is that independent investigations are crucial, but they're too rarely used. And again, one of those key stats we talked about earlier, only 14% of these 100 churches involved in scandals commissioned independent third-party investigation into the allegations. Now, I want you to think about this, though. 43% of the leaders who were investigated late or by other churches were never removed from ministry, which means there's a much higher likelihood the longer you go without an investigation that these leaders aren't going to be removed and they're going to stay in power and authority and continue this behavior. Versus the leaders were much more highly removed from ministry when that investigation was done early. So what are the best practices for a church to handle allegations of sin or misconduct? Well, the best practice is, one, to commission an independent third-party investigation, not to do internal reviews, because it's going to be hard for people inside that church. One, they're not trained to be investigators. Two, it's going to be hard to not try to protect people that you love, like your pastor or church staff. We want to believe the best about these people, so it's really hard to do. Independent third-party investigations, they remove a lot of those issues. I think it's also important for churches to have immediate pastoral leave policies when credible allegations arise. So if you get an allegation and there's any credibility to it at all, that doesn't mean that your pastor is guilty. But what it does mean is that pastor should be put on paid leave until something is figured out. Let's go ahead, let's pursue truth, let's get on this immediately, and let's try to make sure that people are protected, including that pastor. And then the last thing, public accountability. When you have those independent investigations, when you do an investigation of any kind, clear reporting of those findings and the actions taken should be made public. The church should know that, all right? So what do you think? Should churches be required to have independent investigations or to have an independent oversight board for misconduct allegations? Or should we continue just doing these internal reviews where nothing seems to happen? I'm going to let you decide for you, but I think independent investigations and independent oversight boards are a much safer way to go. So the 4 lessons that we learned from this research: number 1, transparency is almost non-existent in unsafe churches. Number 2, church boards too often protect pastors and not people in unsafe churches. Lesson number 3, protective measures are missing in most unsafe churches. And lesson number 4, independent investigations are crucial, but too rarely used. All right, so what do we do? What do we actually do about this? Because it's one thing to talk about all the scandals, to talk about the research, to talk about these problems, but I want to be very specific. And at SAI, we always want to give solutions. From the moment we started the Church Disrupted podcast, we said we want to be solutions oriented. So what do we do to really combat spiritual abuse? Let me be clear. This is not about tearing down the church. We love the church. This is about saving the church from the destruction it's bringing on itself. This is about stopping the next scandal before it even starts. So here are some things that I think practically work, and they actually work in reality. Number 1, churches need to commit to radical transparency. That means things like committing to open financial records. It means committing to giving annual reports that show more than just 4 to 5 pieces of a pie with percentages, because that's not enough. Churches should make their budgets public and let their parishioners ask questions. Another way that this looks practically is real accountability. Board members should not be handpicked yes men and women. Church members should also have a way to raise concerns about inappropriate behavior without retaliation. Because if there's fear of retaliation, they're not going to say something as early as they would otherwise. Number 3, practically, our churches, we need to make a commitment to reporting abuse of any kind. Any kind of alleged abuse, whether that's sexual, whether that's physical, whether that's emotional, spiritual, doesn't matter. We don't need to have any more of this handling things internally approach. Every abuse claim, no matter what kind, should be reported immediately to the authorities if criminal, and if it's not criminal, it should be reported safely and investigated by a third party, and it should be tracked publicly. And that's exactly why we support and why we created the Safe Church Pledge. If you don't know about it yet, again, we're going to link it in the description below. But the Safe Church Pledge is a commitment that churches can make to real and practical accountability, transparency, and creating protective systems and measures for their congregations. The Safe Church Pledge, it was literally built based on this research study, and it goes farther than the research that we've released so far. The pledge, like I said earlier, it expands to 16 safe church practices, and any church, this is the beauty of it, any church of any size can put these 16 safe church practices into place in as little as 18 months. Any church of any size can put these into place within a year and a half. And you can put a lot of those practices into place immediately. So after spending months of researching 100 churches, that faced public scandal in this study, the presence of these 16 safe church practices, not only were they nearly non-existent in these scandals, but the reality is that each one would have significantly reduced the likelihood of spiritual abuse in these situations in the first place. Very few of these churches would have faced scandal at all if they had put safe church practices like this into place. And the few that did, they would have responded in a way that protected victims, that pursued truth and justice, and that would have made us all proud instead of cringe when they came out. So I want to give 2 calls to action as we finish this podcast episode. What can you do? The first call to action is for church leaders. I'm going to get to everybody else here in just a minute. But if you're a church leader who's listening, if you're a pastor, an elder, or a ministry leader who's watching this, I want to challenge you. Will you step up and will you sign the Safe Church Pledge? Because here's the thing. If you wait until a scandal happens in your church to start caring about this stuff, it's already way too late. All right, so would you consider signing the Safe Church Pledge? And if you have questions, contact us, let us know, put Safe Church Pledge in the subject line. I know that we cannot respond to every email, every DM, or any of that. But what we can do is we can scroll through, and anytime we see Safe Church Pledge, we're going to make sure that we respond to that as soon as possible, because we know that if churches are taking the Safe Church Pledge, that we can start protecting people. Okay, it's one of the most impactful things that we can do. So if you have questions, send us a message on the contact form on the website, send us a DM on Instagram, but put Safe Church Pledge, all caps, in the subject line or right up front so that we can see it. Now, I know that most of our listeners, you're not church leaders and you're not pastors. So for everyone else, you can still be a part of this reforming work. If you know of a church that's actually doing things well, or they're trying to do things well and be safe, they're trying to be accountable, they're trying to be transparent, would you nominate them for the Safe Church Pledge? Because here's what I want to do. I want to highlight churches that are trying to do things right so that others can follow their lead. And if you nominate a church, we will reach out to them. We will start a conversation with them, myself or another board member, about taking the pledge and setting the example for other churches in their community. And then once we do that, we get to do my favorite part of this work. My favorite part of this work is highlighting and celebrating churches that work to serve and protect people for a change instead of just lamenting scandal and trying to learn from the heinous sin and scandals that we're seeing. So the same thing, if you want to nominate a church, you can put it in the comments, and we'll usually see that on YouTube because we have at least volunteers or myself at times responding to these comments. But the safest way to nominate a church for the Safe Church Pledge is, again, to send us an email on the contact form, or if you want to send us a DM on Instagram, either way, put in the subject line or at the beginning of the DM in all caps, Safe Church Pledge nomination. And that's going to help us to see that because we want to make sure that we don't miss it. But would you nominate a church, no matter where they're at in the country, that you believe is trying to do this the right way? And if you have relationships with anyone, whether they're a church leader or just a family member at a church or a friend at a church, or you feel comfortable having these conversations in your own church, would you start having conversations with your friends, your family, and your church about taking this pledge? And I'm going to be really honest. I hate to say this because this is uncomfortable. But if you don't feel comfortable even broaching the conversation of the Safe Church Pledge in your church, with your pastor, with your church leaders, that's probably a good sign that you're in a really unsafe church. Because in a safe church, you're always going to feel comfortable being able to bring up this subject, even if they say no. So if you don't feel comfortable, that's something really important to dive into. But here's the deal. If the church is supposed to be the hope of the world, then at some point we've got to start acting like it. And it's by putting into practice these safe church practices, it's one of the easiest ways for us to start to really look like the church that wants to love people, share the gospel, and share the hope of the world. And look, at the end of the day, we can't fix every problem in the church overnight. It's just not going to happen. But here's what we can do. We can stop pretending like these scandals are unavoidable and just another part of church life. Because the reality is they're very avoidable. And there have to be a lot of things that we overlook and a lot of departures from transparency and accountability and protection to get to those points. The truth is, the next scandal, it's already brewing somewhere. We don't have to wait for it. The next scandal's already brewing in a church somewhere. The only question is, who's willing to step up and break the pattern before it's too late? Because if we keep doing the same things, we're going to get the same results. And here's the hard truth for today's episode. If your church resists these changes, it's already on the path to scandal. I'm going to say that again because it's that important. If your church resists these kind of safety changes, they're already on the path to scandal. It's just a matter of time. So let me know in the comments, what do you think a healthy, safe church looks like? What does it look like to you? What are your non-negotiables for church leadership integrity? Let me know below. I want to keep the conversation going. If nothing else, even if I don't see them all, I want us to be able to learn from each other. And before we finish, if this episode was valuable to you, would you mind hitting the subscribe button or sharing this with a friend? Let's work together because we can do more together than I can do on my own. Let's work together to make the church a place of integrity again. And if you want to see more research projects like this, check out that research project in the description below. But if you want to see more projects like this, would you consider making a one-time, or even better, a recurring donation to the Spiritual Abuse Institute? The reality is this work is expensive, guys. This work is expensive, and not only did we not make any money last year, and if you go and you look at the financial report, you'll see, yes, we have money in the bank, but the donated labor, the donated time, the donated software, all of those sorts of things, the board and I actually put $20,000 of our own money into these initiatives last year. And look, we believe in this work. We are glad to do it. The reality is we also know that's unsustainable. I know I can't keep putting that amount of money into it long term. So when I say this, I 100% mean it. We cannot do this work without generous donors like you. And no matter how big or how small your monthly donations are, those monthly donations help us to plan ahead. They help us to continue practically combating spiritual abuse and ensure that the bills are paid for the nonprofit. And this spring, I just want to be, completely transparent, practice what we preach. This spring, we have a goal to add $2,500 a month in recurring donations. That's nothing huge, but if we could add $2,500 a month in recurring donations, and most of those are going to come from listeners who give $5, $10, or $25 a month, these are not going to be big one-time donations. But if we can do that, we're going to be able to actually cover the shortfall and begin to do more of this work than we've ever done before. And because we're a 501c3 nonprofit, all of your gifts are tax deductible, and you can go onto our website at any time and get a detailed report of exactly where every penny goes. At SAI and Church Disrupted, the truth is we don't have mega donors. We don't have corporate sponsors. You know that. All we have is you, our supportive listeners, and our community. You're literally the sponsors of this podcast. So thank you in advance for your support, not only financially, but for every share, every like, every review, every comment. We appreciate you. And every single gift, whether it's $1, $5, $10, doesn't matter. Every gift makes a massive difference in this fight against spiritual abuse and in fighting against the corruption in the church. So if you want to give and you wanted to become a monthly donor, you can click the link in the description. You can click on the card right here in this video, or you can just head to our website at spiritualabuse.institute. There's a way to give right there on the front page. And stay tuned, because in the next few weeks, we're actually going to start announcing some very special new things that we're going to be doing to give back to our donors, because we want to give back to the people who are giving so much to us. So thank you so much for watching today. Thank you for your support. And I'm going to see you again soon on the next episode of the Church Disrupted podcast. But until then, grace and peace. Know you're not alone. We're in your corner, and we're in this fight against spiritual abuse with you. Let's keep the fight going together.